Wagwan fam, where are my day ones who were here back when I responded to this video by Contrapoints in 2019? Probably not that many of you, but now all 18,000 of you are my new day ones because we're going to be responding to this video again. Pretty obvious why, don't need to justify it. I've come much further as a content creator since then, and I tried to watch the original response video and I just couldn't do it. I didn't think it was a very good video, and I don't want to be thinking that about my own videos. So I'm returning back to this video again to produce a new response that comports with my current superior style. If you'd like to see how things used to be, you can find the original video in the description below, but once this goes up, I'm going to be unlisting that original video, mostly to increase the dominance of the previous year on my most viewed videos. Significantly, the first time that I responded to this video by Contrapoints, I hadn't seen any of Contra's other videos on the topic of trans identity, so I didn't really have any frame of reference for what was being said. But now I've not only seen those videos, but I've responded to almost all of them. Real fans know the one video I haven't responded to yet. Another thing real fans do, of course, is support what I'm doing on Patreon, and I'd like to say a huge thanks to those who do. You're all very much appreciated. So with a whole lot of extra creative tools in my belt, I think it's time to go back to my roots and respond to this video. Also, I know last time I responded to Contra, I got out the green screen to kind of make fun of how overproduced a lot of BreadTube videos are. This time I'm not going to do anything like Sorry, one of Contra's video editors must have escaped the opium mines and inserted a musical title card. Let's talk about gender, because if someone is critical of gender, what are they actually critical of? Well, to be fair, Contra does a fantastic job at summarizing the basic point.
The idea is that gender, femininity, masculinity, gender roles, all that, it's all a patriarchal construct, and biological sex is the only thing that makes a person a man or a woman.
Yeah, that just about covers it. I feel like a lot of people forget that disagreeing with trans identity is basically just feminism, right? Because let's suppose I wanted to teach my kids to be woke feminist snowflakes. Well, obviously I would need to teach them not to be sexist. So, I'd tell them, hey, boys can be emotional, men can shoulder a lot of the domestic responsibilities in the home, women can earn more money than men, girls don't have to like pink, basically just challenging the really basic sexist stereotypes that people can learn when they're growing up. And I could simplify that message. Being a boy or girl has nothing to do with the way you present and express yourself. Being a man or woman has nothing to do with the social roles you perform. But kids aren't idiots. They're too young to be idiots yet. They know that words need to mean things, so obviously man and woman must mean something. And I imagine without much prompting, they could probably arrive at the conclusion that what makes men and women different is that they're biologically different. So really, making someone gender critical is just a two-step recipe. 1, don't be sexist. 2, recognize words need to mean things. Spoiler alert, Contra doesn't have a response to this basic syllogism. We established that in my last response to Contra. In that video, Contra basically admitted that the gender critical position is correct. The only argument against it is that it wouldn't allow you to continue to affirm trans identity. If you haven't seen that video, by the way, definitely watch it. I'll link it up here because it's really important that you see that Contra has already admitted the gender critical position is pretty much correct. So since we already know from that video that on the most important question of what is a woman, I'm right, Contra is wrong, let's talk about some peripheral unimportant issues instead. Is it actually possible to abolish gender?
No nails, no makeup, I'm wearing a nice little gender neutral robe moment. I did it, everyone. I abolished gender. My name is 5466417. I have no gender.
Okay, Contra, let me help you out here. When people talk about abolishing gender, they're talking about making gender less important in the average person's life, not making it so nobody ever does anything gendered, literally ever. What this means in practice is that people, for example, wouldn't define themselves on a quite fundamental level with direct reference to their gender. If a whole load of relational terms like mother, son, grandpa, niece, the third person singular pronouns that are baked into our grammar, and our relationship to the oldest and the most significant demographic division in almost every society on earth, if all of that which is basically about the difference between men and women, if all of that is entirely dependent on what gender you perform, that would very much be not abolishing gender. Like, sure, maybe abolishing gender absolutely would be impossible, but if we just have it as a goal that we want to head in the direction of, then obviously saying that my existence as a wife, a she, a victim of patriarchy could all be brought about by me performing the role of a woman Clearly that's going in the wrong direction. This is why statements like this from Contra ring incredibly hollow.
Denying trans people their gender identity because abolish gender is kind of like denying citizenship to immigrants because abolish borders.
Trans people aren't just casually existing in a gendered way, they're actively seeking to reify the significance of gender in the most explicit terms possible. To take the abolishing borders example, yeah, you wouldn't want to take away an immigrant's citizenship, but you might want to prevent them from being overly patriotic about the country they've moved to, because clearly that's just celebrating that country and its existing borders. Also, a lack of citizenship denies you certain rights. What rights would trans-identified people be denied if we did things the gender-critical way? You can present yourself however you like, but that doesn't make you a woman. That's a key point, by the way. Contra gets kind of confused here.
So if trans women being feminine is bad, and trans women being masculine is bad, then there really is no way that trans women could behave that TERFs would accept.
The point is, it's not really about how you behave. I mean, people will comment on how you behave with both legitimate and illegitimate grievances, but you're absolutely right. There's no amount of good behavior that would see your trans identity be accepted. Indeed, I find the idea amongst some GC light people that affirmation of trans identity can be doled out as a reward for good behavior to be gross for all sorts of reasons and wildly inappropriately magnanimous. I didn't decide trans women aren't women, so I can't decide that they are. Biology decided that for me. That's the point. It doesn't matter how masculine or feminine you are, you're still biologically male. And if we said that you could be a woman because you've behaved sufficiently feminine, that would be a horrible message to send to young girls, that there is a degree of femininity that you need to perform in order to qualify as a woman. The final point Contra makes relevant to this is that so-called trans women have to exaggerate their femininity in order to not be upset by being misgendered.
If one person calls me sir, that's gonna ruin my day, so I'm desperately throwing glitter spaghetti at the wall in hopes the light catches some glimmer of womanhood.
But again, you're excusing a problematic mindset by appealing to that same mindset. You clearly think that being a woman is a moral, evaluative judgment, because why else would not being considered a woman be so offensive to you? Well, a message of I need to be perceived as a woman in order to feel valid as a human being, combined with the way that I am perceived as a woman, is by massively exaggerating my conformity to femininity and sexist stereotypes. It shouldn't leave you wondering why it is that a lot of feminists will object to what you're saying. Also, if being called sir would upset you so much, isn't that a good reason not to relate gender identity to the categories of man and woman? Clearly, you do place normative value on gendered assessment, but doesn't relating the categories of man and woman to someone's gendered assessment just maximize the possibility of you being upset by someone just talking to you and referring to you in the way that they think is appropriate? By contrast, if we said that sir is simply describing the objective reality that you are biologically male, what possible rational reason could you have to be offended by that? You're worried that someone might use the wrong words and that would upset you, but you're simultaneously campaigning for those words to be related to something that you place value on, which is the thing that would upset you in the first place, and I just don't understand that. Being called sir would identify me as a man, but if someone calls me a woman instead, why would that offend me? All they're doing is just misdescribing my biology. They're not saying there's some social role they think I should perform. They're not saying there's some fundamental aspect of my essence that is being communicated and described with that. They're just describing what they perceive to be biological reality. You're really making things unnecessarily stressful for yourself by saying that man and woman should instead be describing something much deeper and more evaluative morally for you. Contra presents this video as answering certain key gender-critical questions, although does claim that these questions are being asked disingenuously.
Trans people don't like engaging with these questions because most of the time they're just brandished as weapons against us.
Which I don't really know about. I mean, I'm not asking such questions disingenuously, but at least Contra acknowledges it is possible that these questions are sometimes being asked earnestly.
But if you really are sincerely wondering about the answer to these troll questions, and many people are, then you actually need fairly complicated and nuanced answers.
Ooh, nuance, that sounds fun. Alright, let's give Contra the benefit of the doubt and assume there might be some interesting answers to these questions. By the way, what are these questions?
How can you be a woman without the oppression experiences of girlhood?
Okay, that's obviously actually a very big question, and it's the question Contra kind of focuses on in this video. Now, do so-called trans women actually experience misogyny? Contra points out that people don't wait to see if a perceived woman is trans, and if they do find out the person's trans, they're unlikely to then become more respectful as a result of finding that out.
Hey, beautiful. Where you going, baby? Where you going? Oh, it's tranny. "Excuse me, sir, my mistake. Please proceed freely to your destination."
I'm just imagining someone who doesn't understand sarcasm being really confused right now. Like, the clip just then actually did show someone becoming more respectful after realizing the person was trans. So just to clarify, for the sake of that hypothetical person I just made up, the point of that clip is that actually that doesn't happen. Now, at this point, we could get into the question of how many so-called trans women actually pass, but it's not really relevant because even in the example provided, Contra has the person realizing upon closer inspection that this is actually a trans-identified individual. So the actual point, and it is one I agree with, is that if there is any even very brief moment where someone is perceived to be a woman, then they could, in that moment, actually experience misogyny. And indeed, after it's realized they're not really a woman, however that qualification is made, it's possible they might still experience something adjacent to misogyny. The issue is, as I pointed out before, this could be true for a cross-dresser or a transsexual who's gone through the surgery but doesn't think that surgery or a costume actually makes them a woman. It could also be true for some fetishist who's just pretending to be a woman online anonymously behind an anime profile. In that situation, such a person might experience misogyny in the exact same sense that a so-called trans woman would, but they're not even claiming to be a woman. So the claim that experiencing misogyny is what makes you a woman doesn't work for the biological definition, indeed it's not supposed to work for that definition, and it also doesn't work for the self-identity definition either. Because not everyone who experiences misogyny, if that's quite a broadly defined term, necessarily even identifies as a woman. I think if there's any relevance to the question of whether someone like Contra experiences misogyny, it's actually touched on by Contra here.
I suspect the reason this is such a major talking point for many gender-critical feminists is that there's an element here of stolen valor, the sense of injustice that people are claiming their identity without experiencing their oppression.
See, it's not so much that having experienced these things is what makes you a woman, but rather having not experienced these things is something that makes it incredibly offensive for you to claim to be a woman when you're not. It's a little bit like the idea of cultural appropriation.
Them and they can't say wagwan because they're not black. You're a fucking dickhead. Shut up. I'll punch you up, you dickhead.
Insofar as there's a genuine issue there, it's that you're associating with a community or identity in a very superficial way that you don't actually understand the experiences of. So if Contra does experience misogyny, that wouldn't make Contra a woman, but it would be extra offensive if Contra is claiming to be a woman without actually understanding the misogyny that women experience.
But I've had cis feminists of my race and class tell me that I have no idea what it's like to be talked over and interrupted by men.
Actually, Kropotkin.
Or to experience street harassment, or to have to treat every first date like a potentially life-threatening situation, and it's just bizarre to me that they think that.
I personally wouldn't imagine Contra has no experience of misogyny. I mean, obviously, the more associated you are with women, the more likely you are to experience misogyny, and in our current society, performing femininity to a very high degree does associate you with women. Contra also says this applies to many trans people before they've even transitioned.
Trans women often don't experience male socialization the way cis men do. Many trans women are feminine and queer before they transition.
I think this is probably true, but it actually proves too much, because Contra is comparing this to the experiences of cis men. But men do have all sorts of varied experiences, and I don't think that trans is the only thing that can make that experience massively vary. Men don't have to be trans in order to be effeminate, and they certainly don't have to be trans in order to be gay, and gay people are very gender non-conforming. So yeah, to say all biological females have the exact same experience and no trans-identified male can ever get close to that experience is very simplistic, but it's also simplistic to imply that there is a standard male experience that all trans-identified males massively depart from. And yeah, maybe Contra's experience growing up as a boy was massively different from the experiences of other boys, but it's certainly also going to be massively different from the experiences of girls growing up. Let's move on to the next question.
Why can't you just be a feminine man instead of equating womanhood with sexist stereotypes?
Now, Contra doesn't really answer this question at all, and while it's kind of covered by what we already spoke about regarding abolishing gender, that doesn't get to the key issue. The fact is, it would be a meaningful stand against regressive stereotypes if Contra continued to present in a very feminine way, but didn't claim to be a woman. And as such, the decision to instead present in this way and then say, oh, also I'm a woman, is actively taking a choice in favor of regressive stereotypes. So yeah, that objection isn't really addressed, so we'll move on.
Why are misogynistic gender ideologues erasing the vocabulary needed to discuss female oppression?
And the only response offered to this is,
Medical language that assumes that everyone with a uterus is a woman erases trans men or non-binary people who menstruate and get pregnant.
What you'll notice is that this reasoning is completely circular. Because trans identity is valid, we need to call people menstruators, otherwise we'd be implying men can't menstruate. But men can't menstruate, so actually that's a feature, not a bug. If someone's saying, I disagree with trans identity in part because validating trans identity would mean detaching women from the experience of being biologically female and also atomizing those experiences such as to not appreciate the holistic reality of one's sex, then it's not a valid response to say, but we need to do that because otherwise we wouldn't be able to affirm people's trans identities as valid. If that person's saying that they disagree with trans identity based on that, presumably they don't think that's a legitimate goal in the first place, and certainly not a worthwhile trade-off. So I don't think that Contra provides a good response to any of these questions, nor, of course, is the most important question answered, is there any actual reason to think that a biological male can possibly be a woman? Part of the issue is that Contra, despite presenting this as answering gender-critical questions, is still not willing to engage with gender-critical people.
In preparation to make this video, I posted an invitation to Twitter asking people who used to be gender-critical feminists to share their stories with me.
Used to be gender-critical, so you're still not brave enough to argue with those who have a robust enough understanding of gender-critical ideas that they still actually hold to it and recognize it's the correct position. Very brave. Let's return back to that question I just posited. What positive case can be made for trans identity? I'm interested in this because while I've already said that Contra's lost this argument in previous videos, in a way that wasn't really Contra, because Contra has a habit of playing all sorts of different characters and speaking in character, so there's plausible deniability there. Those weren't Contra's terrible arguments, those were the arguments of a character Contra was playing. But here, Contra isn't playing a character, supposedly. This is a YouTuber just expressing their opinion on issues. These aren't the arguments of Tiffany Tumbles or Jackie Jackson, these are the arguments of Natalie Wynn. So what arguments are given for trans identity? Well, there isn't one. We do get a lot of claims about what trans identity isn't.
Is there literally such a thing as a male soul trapped in a female body or vice versa? I personally don't believe there is.
Okay, that's good that you don't think that, saves me some time having to otherwise debunk it. Is there anything else that doesn't make you a woman?
I'd really rather stay inside collecting ceramics and sucking dick. Now I'm not saying that makes me a woman.
Okay, well, that's a relief. I wouldn't say that makes you a woman either. But statements about what doesn't make someone a woman are a lot more powerful and a lot more meaningful if you also know what a woman actually is. Because otherwise you're just making a video about trans identity and saying, well, I do like filleting willies, and giving that as one of the few examples of what makes you different from a typical man. See, for me, I don't need to clarify that my sexual proclivities aren't what make me a man, because I'm absolutely clear on what does make me a man. My biological reality, that I'm biologically male. That is the only sense in which anyone is ever a man. So if anyone ever worries that I define being a man in a sexist, reductionist way, they can immediately reassure themselves because they know that the way I actually define man is just with reference to material, objective reality. By contrast, if anyone worries that you're defining woman in an objectionable way, they don't have any idea about how you do define it to reassure them.
My view is well expressed by Catherine McKinnon.
I always thought I don't care how someone becomes a woman or a man. Doesn't matter to me. Anybody who identifies as a woman, wants to be a woman, is going around being a woman, as far as I'm concerned, is a woman.
Okay, that's really dumb. Because it's circular. You can't say that the way we define someone as a woman is that they're going around being a woman, because the only way we could conclude someone's going around being a woman is if we've already defined them as a woman, such as to say that what they're doing is being a woman. It's a textbook example of a circular argument. The problem is if we try to make this non-circular, then we actually have to anchor being a woman to something other than the identity itself. And if that's not biological sex, the only other thing it could really be is performing a certain social role. And that's not feminism. Saying women are women because of the role they perform is like the opposite to feminism. Also, even if you do define it that way, that's still not particularly coherent, because as you yourself have pointed out, women have wildly different social experiences.
For some women, having babies is the most essentially womanly experience. For others, maybe it's having an abortion.
So that's another issue of this whole social role definition of woman. But the real issue here is that the actual definition you presented is a circular nonsense one, where a woman is just someone who goes around being a woman. And then you have the gall to say that anyone who disagrees with of this just doesn't understand and isn't familiar with trans feminism.
Questions about the details. And in particular, people who are familiar with feminist theory, but not trans feminism.
If you're going to call out people for not being familiar with your ideas, you may want to make sure you're doing that in a video where you've actually offered any defense of your ideas at all. Otherwise, I can't help but think the more people who become intimately familiar with the nonsense you're spouting, the better that would be for the gender critical cause. By the way, it's worth defining trans just as much as woman, because at one point Contra says this:
You don't know what it's like to occupy an identity so stigmatized that most of the people who are attracted to you in private are too ashamed to admit it in public. You don't know what it's like to have a body so non-normative that you're shut out of whole areas of society.
And okay, yeah, there is a unique experience of transness that it does seem to be worth acknowledging, but is that based on identity? Even Contra's other videos seem to show some recognition this isn't really the case. Now, I'd happily define transness as a role someone performs. I mean, that's how we define sexuality, right? If you're going around banging a bunch of dudes and you're a dude, you're a gay guy. But the issue is, if you actually make trans identity mean something, then you forfeit the entire foundation of the self-identity definition of woman. On the subject of trans not even seeming to mean anything in trans ideology, it can be entertaining to ask these people sometimes, can a biological female be a trans woman? And it can be even more entertaining to insist that a biological female is a trans woman. I won't get into this too much because in my previous video I went on a whole rant about how trans ideology actually denies the reality of the trans experience almost as much as it denies the reality of the so-called cis experience, because that's what happens when you start using words and you don't give them any meaning. They can't actually describe anybody's experience. Also, it's inherently contradictory to place a massive amount of importance on the experience of being a woman.
And I tried every possible alternative to transitioning before realizing that I had an irrepressible need to become a woman.
When you can't even define what a woman is. What did you need, Contra? When you say you needed to be a woman, what change satisfied that need? Was it surgery? Was it makeup? Was it wearing a dress? Was it being called a woman? Was it
sucking dick?
Well, whatever it was, none of that made you a woman. So therefore, if anything satisfied your need to be a woman, then you didn't actually need to be a woman in the first place, because you still aren't one. I'm sure there was some deeply held longing that you experienced, and that's worth exploring and understanding. But the only way we can do that is by actually defining words properly and making sure that we actually recognize the reality of your situation. Towards the end of the video, Contra likens so-called transphobia to homophobia.
You know, I came of age when gay marriage was the most contentious social debate, and the arguments people made, that marriage was under attack, that the children would be traumatized, that bestiality would be next, that this tiny minority was undermining all our institutions with their outrageous demands, it was all just nonsense.
But really, the two things aren't comparable at all. The objection to trans identity is an objection to a claim being made about reality. All the examples of homophobia are about some moral concerns someone might have about homosexuality. You wouldn't worry that homosexuality is going to corrupt children unless you had some moral issue with it. But when I say that trans identity is wrong, I'm not saying that in a moral sense. I'm saying that an objectively false claim about reality is being made. In that sense, it's more like a religion than something innate like sexuality. You have a belief that a biological male can be a woman. Okay, I respectfully disagree. Contra basically concludes the video by saying that gender criticals are ultimately just disgusted by trans people. Indeed, Contra claims to have also been disgusted by trans people in the past.
It's a disgust I can recognize at a glance, because it's the same disgust I felt toward myself for years. It's the disgust I felt when I clocked a trans woman on the L platform in Chicago 5 years ago and decided then and there to abandon my first attempt at transition.
I routinely bring up this comment in all my responses to Contra because it's worth noting that Contra's ability to actually understand the gender critical position is going to be massively hindered by having previously been disgusted by the group that gender critical people are actually arguing against the beliefs of. But really what matters isn't Contra and all the other people who are apparently disgusted by the existence of trans people, not in a discussion about whether or not trans identity is accurate. What matters there is me, someone who isn't disgusted by trans people, someone who doesn't even begin to feel a sense of disgust. The only thing I experience is what I always experience when I hear someone make a claim, a curiosity as to whether or not that claim is accurate. Contra tries to claim that this rational disagreement with trans identity is also in some way hateful and bigoted, claiming, for example, that the term trans-identified male is really offensive.
TIMS, an acronym for trans-identified males, and trans men TIFs, trans-identified females, obviously with the intent of mockery and misgendering.
Like, just for the record, the actual reason to use this term is precisely because it's not offensive, it's neutral and impartial. A trans-identified male is a male who identifies as trans. The only reason I've started using that term a lot less nowadays is because there are some people who say that term is kind of confusing to them. Apparently some people hear trans-identified male and they understand that as a trans person who identifies as a male, which I can kind of understand. That's why nowadays I often use the term so-called trans woman. Occasionally I'll drop the so-called there, but I'm reluctant to, because in reality I think that someone can only ever be a so-called trans woman, because you can't actually be a woman in a trans sense. You're either a woman or you're not, and therefore there is no such thing as a trans woman, so someone is only ever a so-called trans woman. Anyway, the point is that while this video is called gender critical, and therefore you'd think it should address gender critical concerns, the kind of concerns that I would bring up, it doesn't really do a good job at that. Like, yeah, if your only reason for rejecting trans identity is that you find trans-identified people disgusting, that's not a good reason. You can't say an argument is wrong just because you are disgusted by the people who make that argument. But that's not my argument. I've never claimed that, because I don't actually find trans-identified people disgusting at all. I think they're really sexy. So, what did we learn? I guess we learned if you're going to claim that biological males can be women, don't expect people to agree with you unless you've given them an argument. If you're going to make a video targeted against the women who disagree with you, make sure you provide some reasonings for why those women shouldn't disagree with you, and definitely don't just claim the only reason they could possibly disagree with you is because they just naturally find you disgusting, because you haven't made any arguments, so maybe that's the reason they disagree with you. Anyway, apart from that, like, share, comment, subscribe, all that stuff you can give on Patreon. If you give on Patreon, you get access to a bonus reaction video, which I will now show you a clip from.
For people who are male, and we start calling them she, her, female, woman, it becomes impossible to say, but you are not welcome here. And the thing is, we're back
Well,
to...
society in general needs, like, words to mean things, and, like, language to mean things, because... Well, I mean, like, even the whole issue about slurs, like, that's predicated on the idea that slurs mean things, and I can't just arbitrarily decide that toaster is a slur now. It's like, if you say toaster, that's actually really offensive. It's like, well, no, I don't just get to unilaterally decide that. Just like a biological male can't decide that being called a man is offensive.
So if that looks interesting, you can gain access to my Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and that also gives you the ability to vote on what other response videos I will do. If that is appealing to you, then you can go check that out and you'll be very appreciated. I will see you all next Wednesday.